One of the things that we've noticed the past few years, really, so not just a shift in 2025, is pre-leasing is kind of happening a lot earlier on in the leasing season. More recently, we've seen properties and markets kind of getting to around 50% pre-leasing, trying to get to 50% pre-leasing by the start of the spring semester. I think this is kind of a longer term trend that we've noticed in the sector, where student housing isn't completely immune from multifamily despite having its own unique demand driver. Primary state schools, really your largest state schools with enrollment over 30,000 students and kind of lower acceptance rates, those are going to be the schools that continue to outperform.
Hello, and welcome to another student housing discussion with Tyson Huebner, Director of Research with Yardi Matrix. We'll talk about the current shifts in the market, how international enrollment growth is affecting the sector, the current occupancy and rent growth rates, and what's ahead for student housing in 2026. Hello, Tyson. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation to discuss student housing further. I have a few questions for you. Looking back at 2025, what were the main shifts that shaped the sector and how were those reflected in the data?
Sure, great question, and thanks for having me. So one of the things that we've noticed the past few years, really, so not just a shift in 2025, is pre-leasing is kind of happening a lot earlier on in the leasing season, and we've seen that, and that kind of translates also to a slowdown in pre-leasing activity later on in the leasing season. So more recently, we've seen properties and markets kind of getting to around 50% pre-leasing, trying to get to 50% pre-leasing by the start of the spring semester. And I think one way that's also showed up in the data is you see rent growth slowing a lot quicker later on in the leasing season as properties are trying to fill their remaining beds. So I think that just shows the sector is becoming a lot more competitive over the past few years, and really put a lot more pressure on operations for performance. And I mentioned that rent growth has been slowing. That's been really a 3 or 4 year trend. So far this year, we've seen rents growth pretty flat. It's averaged about 0.2% for the leasing season. And I think another nuance to that is just overall multifamily performance. So we've seen, and I've heard a lot of operators talk about having more competition from competitive multifamily properties around universities, particularly in some of the Sunbelt markets that have seen the most construction. So places like Austin, Orlando, Phoenix. These are places where you have a lot more competitive multifamily. In addition to additional student housing properties around campus, you've seen a lot more competitive multifamily built. And as these properties lease up, and they're leasing up really slowly, kind of historically slowly right now, you've seen them compete a lot more for student tenants and offering pretty aggressive concessions. So I think this is kind of a longer term trend that we've noticed in the sector, where student housing isn't completely immune from multifamily despite having its own unique demand driver. And I think it's definitely something that has kind of changed and become more important over the past few years. And we've really tried to highlight that in our content. We're tracking multifamily around these universities. And I think that's an important shift in thinking about operations.
Has there also been competition between off-campus student housing and on-campus student housing?
That's a really good point. While we've seen on our off-campus student housing development pipelines kind of slow the past few years, we have seen on-campus development kind of pick up. And interestingly, it's a lot of the same developers that are developing off-campus student housing. They're doing it in public-private partnerships. So that student housing on campus is starting to look a lot more like off-campus student housing. And I think the sector has some great tailwinds in the form of declining off-campus development, but on-campus development is certainly something to pay attention to as well.
And where do you see occupancy landing over the next leasing season? What about rent growth?
I think occupancy this year should end up kind of around where we were last year, which is like 93.5%. It could end up a bit lower, just based on some of the pre-leasing and rent growth numbers that we've seen. I think rents are going to continue to kind of be a struggle. I think rent growth will probably be flat to slightly down this year. But, student housing has always been a sector where there's a big range in performance at the market level, at the property level. There's still some schools where we're seeing rent growth 8 to 10+%. And those are the same schools I think will be fully occupied for the next school year. And then there are other schools where we're seeing, rents declining 8 to 10% or more. And, those schools could see occupancy kind of in the 80s. So this is something that we've noticed with student housing for many, many years. And one of the reasons I tell people that they really need to have a diversified portfolio, because your best performing markets this year are probably not going to be your best performing markets in the next few years. And, there is a path for recovery for schools that struggle.
Mm-hmm. Talking about schools, which types of schools do you think will win demand over the next few cycles? I'm referring to flagship state schools, secondary state schools, or private schools, and why?
Yeah, so that's been really a consistent theme in student housing. Primary state schools have really been the top performing markets. It's kind of inconsistent. It's really based on where new supply is being delivered. But I think primary state schools, really your largest state schools with enrollment over 30,000 students and kind of lower acceptance rates, those are going to be the schools that continue to outperform. Interestingly, those are also a lot of the schools where development activity has been focused. So schools with a combination of growing enrollment, high enrollment, and kind of limited, not necessarily no new supply, those are the schools that are going to outperform. And that's also something, it's not just, we're not just seeing that reflected in supply data and performance data, but those are also the schools that seem to have the best prospects for enrollment growth, because student housing has a very unique demand driver and enrollment, and the long-term prospects for enrollment growth are not nearly what they were 10 to 20 years ago. And as we see enrollment growth slow nationally, I think those primary state schools are the ones that are going to be kind of the beneficiaries of declines at smaller secondary, tertiary state schools. Private schools also have struggled as they rely more on tuition. And I think there's been somewhat of an affordability crisis among students. So I see tertiary and state schools and private schools continue to kind of underperform.
Mm-hmm. Since you mentioned enrollment, how do you expect any decline in international enrollment to affect student housing, and which markets would feel it the most?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something we've been focused a lot in our content. I actually recently spoke to a representative from Open Doors, their kind of main source for tracking international student enrollment. I spoke to her right after they released their fall 2025 data. Interestingly, even though I think it was prominently featured in the media, there was a 17% decline in international student visa activity in August. That was just for new foreign students. And we've seen really a rapid increase in international students over the last 4 years. And many of the students that have already been in the US studying were able to figure out their visa situation kind of before. Mm-hmm. So I think the impact is really going to be kind of over the next 3 to 4 years. I've seen some sources say 20, 30, even 40% decline in international students, which would definitely have an impact on the sector. But interestingly, the schools that have the highest international student enrollment seem to be larger primary state schools with kind of low acceptance rates, or Ivy League schools that really can backfill that foreign student enrollment by accepting more domestic students. I think one interesting example, actually two interesting examples this year, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and Purdue University, which have two of the highest, particularly undergraduate international student enrollments, but also graduate students. They were both actually able to grow 4 to 5% this year, and were two of the schools with the top growth, which I think is pretty surprising, but shows you how even in the face of declining international student enrollment, schools are able to kind of adjust. So I think where you're going to see the impact is at the secondary, tertiary state schools in those states where they're going to lose out on those students that might not have been accepted to U of I or Purdue. That's really where you're going to start to see the impact over the next 3 to 4 years.
Mhm. I have one more question. Following our Student Housing 2026 Outlook article, in which I talked with some experts regarding the sector, they believe that consolidation and selectivity will shape student housing in 2026. And when we're talking about consolidation, we're referring more to platform consolidation, considering that, Kennedy Wilson acquired Toll Brothers Apartment Living, and then Hugo acquired Campus Advantage, and they're growing their platform for student housing. Do you agree that those are the defining themes, or is there something else to look for going forward?
Yeah, certainly on the operations side, there's consolidation happening in the sector, and I think it shows up also on the development side. We've seen the top developers account for a much higher percent of the total beds built overall, and really the reason for that is, as it's become more expensive and kind of more complicated to build, you've seen consolidation, and you've seen really the most experienced developers kind of have the advantage. And at the same time, they've focused a lot of their efforts on larger projects in some of those top markets at primary state schools. So consolidation is definitely across the board. I just mentioned enrollment, like enrollment growth is really becoming more concentrated. So I certainly think that is, major theme, over the next decade for the industry.
All right. Thank you very much.